Good evening and welcome to the overnight edition of From Day One. Art Bell and Kevin Randle are waiting in the wings. Again, 100 plus years of UFO cover-ups is tonight's topic. We're on part 2 of 3. And at this point, Randle was just talking about how it gets hard to determine nowadays content as it is rather easy to fake with technology. So let's return to the Great American Southwest, Art Bell and Kevin Randle from November 17th, 2015, as we march through Dominion.
Point being simply that in today's environment with the computer equipment that's available to practically everybody, that a 10-year-old kid could make a very convincing UFO video. The other thing that I noticed in my research was that about 99% of the UFO pictures were taken by teenage boys, and 99% of those are faked. And we have seen a lot of the great pictures from the 50s and 60s. The people who took them have come out and said, yeah, I faked that. The one exception is the Lubbock Lights from 1952 or 1951, taken by Carl Hart Jr. I was on it, part of the Roswell investigation in Lubbock in 1995, and I picked up the phone book and looked up Carl Hart just on a lark, and he had a phone number, so I called him to see what he had to say. And he said, here's a guy who is now in his 60s. If he was going to admit that he'd faked it, now was the time to do it. But he said, I still don't know what I photographed. He wasn't sure it was alien. He wasn't sure it was extraterrestrial. He was just puzzled about what he had photographed. He didn't know what it was, but he did not fake it. So there's the exception to the rule. He was 19 when he made the photographs. And like I said, I talked to him in the mid-1990s, so he was a much older gentleman. And a lot of the people, the teenagers, the young men who faked the UFO photographs would come forward and say, yeah, I faked those.
Do you go to Kevin, go to recent movies? For example, did you see San Andreas?
No. I saw The Martian.
The Martian. Okay, good. That's fine. That's a good example. CGI has come so far, Kevin, that what we see on the screen can be made to look more real than real. So
Absolutely.
The end of it's over. I mean, anything can be faked, and it can be faked to look really, really good. My experience is that if you have a blurry UFO photograph, everybody goes, another blurry photograph. If it's too clear, they go, it's too clear.
Yes, I've run into that too. No matter what you do in the way of the UFO spectrum, they're going to complain about it for some reason. But that was my point, is that the computer-generated graphics, images that you can do on your home computer can look so real.
Oh, yeah.
That you don't need a Hollywood studio. In the 1950s, there were two wonderful movies taken of UFOs, one in Great Falls, Montana in 1950 and one in Tremonton, Utah in 1952. And they're basically lights in the sky, but they were taken on 16-millimeter movie camera. And to do something like that, the people would have had to have some sophisticated Hollywood equipment to assist them in it. Today's world, my home computer can do that sort of thing and generate much better UFO photographs and footage than came out of the 1950s.
So then, in this modern day and age that you and I just documented, what in the world can we do to separate the wheat from the chaff anymore? Even in terms of pictures, stories, whatever.
Well, it's the same investigative problem that we've always had. It comes back to the credibility of the witness. Who took the pictures? Is it a teenage boy? Well, there's a credibility problem right there. But if you understand the background of it, if there's more than a single witness, if there's independent witnesses, what would be ideal is people in 3 separate locations photographing the same thing. And that way you could triangulate on it. You could get an idea of distance.
Yeah, well, there's been some of that. Look at Phoenix and the lights in Phoenix. How about that one?
But you could not put together the triangulation that you could if you've got a still footage. There were problems with some of it was clearly flares. Some of it was clearly a huge triangular shaped craft moving across the state of Arizona. And the photographic footage, you could not use it to triangulate that way, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. But we need something like that where you've got the people at multiple locations photographing the same thing at the same time, and you independently discovering these witnesses, so you could get their stories, you could get measurements from the photographs that they made. And we just don't get that sort of thing. And I was wondering, there was a picture taken of a meteor skipping over the skipping out back out of the atmosphere, taking over the Grand Tetons. And I don't know how long ago. I've seen the picture.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful picture of this meteor, and there were people all over that part of Wyoming that got pictures, and a guy from Des Moines, Iowa, actually got movie footage of it. Wonderful, wonderful film. And you're thinking, well, if we can do that with a meteor, which is a very short-lived event, and something that you in the daylight like that you could actually film, why don't we have UFO sightings like that? And the answer is because that meteor was 50 miles up in the sky, or higher when it skipped out of the atmosphere, and the UFOs are normally operating at much lower altitude, so you don't have the wide range of people seeing that sort of thing. So that's the kind of thing that we need. I know that Ted Phillips, in his Landing Traces, he would tell you that if you gave him information from measurements that you took in the landing trace, he could tell you what kind of craft the people would have seen. Mm-hmm. Which suggests a certain amount of repeatability and suggests a certain amount of scientific research that could be done by that sort of thing.
I was always impressed by the UFOs that appeared over our missile silos, Kevin. There was an awful lot of cooperation of that. Not only that, but it would seem an odd time for the missile silos to shut down. And then there was a similar incident in Russia. It seems to me that if UFOs are here, they would be certainly interested in our, military capability, where we are, what we can do, that sort of thing. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. But we have to look at it from the other point of view. If you've got an outside source, which the UFO was, and it could shut down the missile systems so they could not launch, now you've got a national security issue.
Yeah, Kevin, the whole thing is a national security issue. If you have things going through your atmosphere at thousands of miles an hour, Kevin, and they are tracked by radar, and you don't know what they are and you can't stop them, you have a national security issue.
That's not quite the same as an object hovering over a missile complex and shutting down the missiles.
Not quite the same, but still a national security issue.
But shutting down the missiles, if the Soviets could have figured out how to do it,
yeah,
or we could have figured out how to do it to the Soviets, I mean, you've just suddenly changed the balance of power.
Right.
And so that became, in the sightings in Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967, where they shut down the missile silos, and the Condon Committee was investigating that. And interesting, the guy who was the UFO officer at Malmstrom was a guy named Lewis, who was the pilot in command of the RB-47 sighting from 1957, which is kind of an interesting coincidence. But when the Condon Committee went to investigate, they said, well, we can't tell you it's classified. And the guy says, well, we have clearance. And he said, no, this is national security. And it's because they were shutting down the missiles. And that's the key right there. You've got something that the Condon Committee actually knew was a national security issue, and they said, well, it doesn't affect national security. Well, that affected it immensely. Mm-hmm. And I think it scared a lot of people that something was able to shut down the missiles so they could not launch them. They eventually came up with some kind of cockamamie explanation about an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, from an atomic explosion that had taken place sometime in the past.
What?
Pardon me?
That's ridiculous.
Absolutely ridiculous.
EMPs are instant.
They had an explanation, and they were happy with that because they could give that to the public, and the public doesn't understand what didn't understand what EMPs were and that sort of thing. So And these things are supposed to be shielded so the EMP does not affect them.
Uh-huh.
So that made it a issue of national security that is much more ominous than them flying through the atmosphere at 1,000 or at several thousand miles an hour, and our fighters cannot catch up to them.
Well, that's upsetting as well.
Yes, but yes, because the Air Force is supposed to be able to keep our skies clear of foreign invaders, whomever they are. And clearly they were unable to do that, but they palmed that part of national security off. But when it came down to the missile silos, they became very paranoid about that.
Seems to me the end of the Blue Book operation was something that said that whatever these things are, they're not a threat to national security or something like that.
They said that they pose no threat to national security, and further study would not result in anything of a scientific value being learned. And the Air Force was wasting its time. If you look at, and that was a result of the Condon Committee investigation at the University of Colorado. And what you have to look at from that is 30% of the sightings in the Condon report were not explained. One of them was explained as a natural phenomenon so rare it had never been seen before or since. And I'm thinking, to my unscientific mind, that if you've identified a natural phenomenon that rare, maybe something of a scientific value could be learned by attempting to study that. And then they said, the Air Force had done a good job of their investigation. And you look at a letter written by a lieutenant colonel named Hippler to the Condon Committee before they started their investigation. And Hippler outlined exactly what they wanted the Condon Committee to find, and the Condon Committee found exactly those sorts of things. I mean, he laid it out. Say some nice things about what the Air Force has done. It doesn't pose a threat to national security, and we should conclude the investigation. That's what the Condon Committee said. Condon was at a speech in Corning, New York, 18 months before the end of the study period. And he said to the scientists there, I'm inclined to tell them that there's nothing to this and they should end this thing right now, but I'm not supposed to reach that conclusion for another 18 months.
Really?
So, I mean, we've got all that evidence that the Condon Committee was a put-up job, and yet we still have scientists citing it as proof that there's no such thing as UFOs.
All right. Now, with respect to what I asked you a little while ago, all the stuff that went on in the 40s and 50s, when it was really just going nuts. I mean, even over the White House, UFOs were all over the place, and people did get pictures of them. But as we posited a little while ago, everybody's got a camera now. The sightings are down. Do you think it's possible that whoever they are, they took a look at us, they assessed us, and they're not much coming around anymore?
I think, and that's kind of what Carl Flock and I discussed, was that they came, they gathered their information as quickly as they could, which took several years, and then they went home to analyze it. And so they're in the process of analyzing it and setting up their next expedition to Earth to see what's going on. I think, personally, Carl Sagan said at one point that we could expect a visitation from an alien race once every 10,000 years. He didn't tell me when we could start counting that. But I'm thinking if I'm a spacefaring race and I come to Earth even 5,000 years ago, and I see the beginnings of civilization, I see intelligent life, I'm going to want to come back frequently to see how that intelligent life is developing and what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So you would expect them to make more visitations as our societies grew, as our civilization grew. But in the last 25, 30 years, we just don't see that sort of thing going on. And the conclusion that I've sort of come to is they're home analyzing the data they collected. If you look at the 1973 sightings, the 6 weeks, last 2 weeks in October, all of November, the first 2 weeks in December, you've got a lot of sightings of the craft on the ground. You've got a lot of sightings of the occupants. You've got a lot of abduction cases. And it just looks like they're gathering data. They're gathering data. They're not analyzing it. They're gathering it to take home so they can analyze it once they get back to their home worlds. And that, that makes some sense to me. It would explain why we don't get the robust sightings that we used to get. And I think maybe another problem is we are now more sophisticated, meaning that things that would have fooled us 50 years ago, we identify now as something natural. We understand what that natural phenomenon is, and so we don't bother reporting what would have been a UFO.
Okay, well, what you just said would suggest that the phenomenon never was real and isn't real now.
No.
No?
Because if you look at it, it says that 95% of the sightings that were reported to the Air Force were identified. But that turns out not to be true either, by the way.
Well, I'm open to everything. When I say I'm a skeptic, if UFOs are not real, I can live with it, Kevin. It's not going to end my life. I do a show about this sort of thing, but I'm seeking the real truth. And,
me too.
You too.
And the thing is, you have to look at all the evidence. And there's an awful lot of people, especially when we go back into the 1940s, 1950s, that didn't understand the natural phenomenon around us. Ball lightning, which kind of cracked me up in the 1960s, before science said, yes, there is such a thing as ball lightning, the Air Force actually used that as an explanation for a UFO case. And I'm thinking, how can you use a phenomenon that is not scientifically proven to explain something else that's, unusual? But I think if you look at the sighting reports that we get today, we don't get as many reports of things that can be explained as natural phenomena. We've become more sophisticated in what we're seeing.
Well, I think, Kevin, if the government doesn't want us to believe in UFOs, then they've taken exactly the wrong tack. I remember when they did their big presentation about Roswell, and they put the dummies on TV, and it was the most laughable insult to intelligence that you could ever imagine. And it's like, once they put on something like that, it's like, what a bunch of lying idiots. Then of course it must be true.
But the thing is, if you watch the news conference, which of course I did.
I did too.
You could see the reporters laughing at them.
I know.
But now, 20 years later, the reporters are saying, well, the Air Force explained all that as these anthropomorphic dummies that were dropping in high altitude tests.
Yeah, well, today's press, you can't compare. You cannot compare today's media, the lazy bums in media today, to then. There's just no comparison.
Well, that's true too. That's absolutely true. But but I understand what you're saying, and I mean, we were all laughing about that. But today, I think the news media today, they want to think of themselves as so sophisticated. They don't believe in UFOs, and nobody else should. These two clowns in New Jersey launched a number of hot air meteorological balloons with flares attached to them to prove how credulous UFO sighters are and investigators are. And if you go back and you look at the investigation, you see that the UFO investigators, Mark D'Antonio from MUFON, their photographic the photographic expert, looked at the videotape and said immediately, that's either flares on a balloon or Chinese lanterns. I mean, he identified it immediately. And you talked to some of the police officers, and they knew it was balloons with flares on it. And you listen to the witness statements. They're explaining exactly what they saw. They're not bringing in aliens. They're not talking spacecraft. They're telling, I saw these lights. They traveled across the sky. They didn't make any noise. And in one point, they seemed to be flickering, and the news commentator commented on that, and the woman who'd seen it said, no, that's because it was passing behind the trees. And so that's why it seems to be flickering that way. Right. They explained exactly what they wanted, but you get the news media, and you've got some reporter out there, and she's interviewing a little kid with her lollipop, and asked the little kid, well, do you think there's aliens? Where did that come from? That's, preposterous. We're interviewing a kid, and we're talking about aliens, but they're too sophisticated to believe in this stuff. So they mock it because they don't understand it.
Kevin, if the UFO phenomenon, whatever it is or isn't, is true, how is it the U.S., and we are the main people that do this, have been able to keep the lid on it for so long now?
Well, interesting you brought that, because in the UFO dossier, I was looking at the Australian investigation of UFOs. And the guy that wrote the original report in Australia had quoted some stuff from Don Kehoe about, his opinions on UFOs and the government conspiracy to hide the information. The Australian Air Force got the report, and they called and asked the U.S. Air Force, what's going on with this Kehoe guy? And the Air Force mocked Kehoe and said, well, he's a liar. He's just out trying to make money. He's just drawing all these conclusions based on things that he's made up. The documents he's saying existed don't exist and all that sort of thing. So the Air Force, the Australian Air Force, believing the United States Air Force on this, wasn't very interested in UFOs. Turned out that we can now sit here in 2015 and look at what Kehoe was saying and say, yeah, Kehoe was basically right. Kehoe had it on the money. He was talking about documents that existed. He had talked to people on the inside who was telling him what was going on. But the U.S. Air Force, and I probably should make it clear that the U.S. Air Force guys talking to the Australian Air Force guys may not have been keyed into what was going on. They were just responding to what their superiors had told them. But the U.S. Air Force kind of drove the Australian investigation and set it into the same tumbling atmosphere that our UFO investigation was, so that that the people don't know what they're seeing, they're making mistakes and all of this sort of thing. And it turns out that there's some very good cases that came out of Australia, but that's kind of how they do it. And if you look at the Rendlesham Forest case, which is the Air Force guy seeing the object in the woods in Rendlesham Forest in Great Britain, and I think it was Nick Pope, who was in the Ministry of Defense at one point, pointed out that the documentation that was exchanged between the United States and Great Britain at the time was the Americans saying, well, this happened on British soil, it's yours, it's your baby, it's your hot potato, you need to deal with it. And the British were saying, no, it was American airmen stationed in an American base that made the sightings. You guys need to deal with it. And so they're arguing about who's going to deal with this thing, and nothing's getting done. And our airmen, Burroughs and Pendleton specifically, were apparently injured by their close approach to the UFO. And I think Burroughs just recently got full disability from the Air Force, admitting that he was injured in the line of duty, not admitting that there was a UFO involved.
No, that is true. I interviewed him, just a month ago.
I've known him for quite a long time. But I mean, the point is they were busy arguing about whose responsibility it was to investigate this case, neither one wanting to do it.
Just in case something comes of this, Kevin, I'm getting word that at about 8:15 p.m., there was a major sighting somewhere in South Orange County. They're seeing military helicopters looking for something in South Orange County. Somebody else may have seen it or know what's going on. I just wanted to mention that while we're sitting here saying there hasn't been much lately. There you go.
Just wanting to prove us wrong.
I guess, yeah.
Well, we've had some good sightings. We had the Chicago O'Hare sightings in 2008. We had the Stevensville sightings, which were very good. We had, you go back to 1986, and we had the Japanese JAL, I think it was 1628 flight.
Oh, yes.
That was radar tracked, and the complete radar records exist so that the FAA was able to recreate the sighting sort of in real time, the whole 28 minutes or 32 minutes or whatever it was. And I talked to John Callahan about that, and he was, they could watch the object on the radar screen and what was going on. So he didn't have an explanation for it, and he said that he'd gone to the White House to brief somebody about that sighting, and there were a number of CIA guys there, and the CIA guys, so to him, we were never here. Don't talk about this. So he had all this data, good evidence, the instrumentality being involved in the sighting, not only that, and the witness statements. I was never able to figure out whether there were two ground-based radar stations involved or one, because it seemed that there was one site picking up the radar images, but it was transmitted to the Air Force and to the FAA, and they used different filters and discriminators on it. So it may have been a single radar source on the ground, but the radar on the airplane also saw the object.
Kevin, it seems to me if this is an advanced race that's come light years to get to us for reconnaissance or whatever reason they're here for, if they don't want to be seen, Kevin, it seems to me they would have the technology to completely escape any sort of detection at all. And the fact that we do see them, to me, says that they don't mind that they're being seen and or they want to be seen.
I hate to quote Philip Klass, but he did make a good point by saying if they don't want to be seen, why don't they turn off their lights?
Well, yeah.
And it's a good point, but I think it's really a case of in some instances they don't want to be seen and we really can't detect them, and in other cases they just really don't care whether we see them or not. Our stealth technology is such that we can, some of our stealth aircraft are virtually invisible to radar. If they're flying around at night, you won't be able to see them. They've got the sound dampers on them and all of this stuff, so that you may not be able to hear them. So they're virtually indetectable at night.
Well, we're at a break here, so hold tight. Kevin Randle is my guest. We're talking about ufology.
Get a shiver in the dark. It's raining in the park. Meantime, sound of the river, you stop and you hold everything. A band is blowing Dixie, double fall.
While midnight sweeps across America, you found an oasis for the mind. To call Midnight in the Desert, please dial 1-952. Call ART, that's 1-952-225-5278.
My guest is Kevin Randle, and for many years, I guess almost all his adult life, he has been investigating ufology. And when I said earlier that, really in recent years, there have not been that many gigantic UFO sightings, something on the level of Roswell. Of course, we've had the Phoenix Lights, but I frankly expected him to disagree with me, as Linda Moulton Howe did and as Peter Davenport did. And they both think that actually UFOs are on the increase. Let me do this. Let me ask about the latter part of your book, Kevin, which documents an awful lot of humanoid encounters with alien beings in your book. What can you tell us about those?
What I did was I wanted to bring the book into the 21st century, naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter Davenport was actually helpful with this as well. But I looked at I got in touch with a number of people who had been collecting UFO sightings. And so what I have there is the raw data, thinking that others may wish to investigate the case. If a case is in your backyard, for example, you might be interested in trying to find out a little bit more about it. So I'm trying to encourage others to take a look at some of these cases, and I settled on the humanoid cases because I found those to be more interesting than the lights in the sky. I mean, lights in the sky are basically lights in the sky, and it really doesn't advance our knowledge to investigate those in depth. But if you've got a humanoid report where something's going on the ground or close to the ground, then you've got something that's a lot more interesting and a lot more robust.
Okay, so you reported on what people have said, but did not investigate these yourself.
In very few cases, I did not investigate. Now, I had a lot of raw data, and I eliminated some of it simply because it seemed to me to be quite credulous. Some of it was not in the United States, and in those cases, I wanted to focus on the United States for obvious reasons. But I just thought that this raw data would be of interest to people, and I know that when I was first beginning my UFO investigations, this sort of data would have been very valuable to me, especially if I could find something from around my home turf. And that was what I did when I lived in Texas, when I was on active duty in the Army, and I lived in Texas. I would go out to the UFO sighting areas in Texas. In fact, went to Aurora, Texas, to talk to them about the UFO crash there in 1897, and actually talk to some people, because this was the early 1970s. I talked to people who had been alive in 1897 and remembered, or alleged to have remembered, some of the events that took place then. So I thought that this kind of raw data would be of interest to people and it allowed them to get more engaged in UFO research. They might find an explanation. There was a case here in Iowa where a man and a woman had seen seen a number of UFOs coming close to the ground, and the woman reported that she'd seen two alien shapes in the lights. And I went out and talked to her, and she had a very robust story. I went out and talked to him, and he said, I don't know what she's talking about, because all we saw were lights. And I went to the actual location where they had seen the UFOs and realized what they had seen, and that they were close to the municipal airport. And if the landing pattern was right, you got the impression of these lights coming down out of the sky and just sort of disappearing behind the trees. And that I am convinced what they saw.
Airplane.
But it was an opportunity for me to go out and investigate a case on my own and learn something about it and get some insight about how these things transpired. So that was kind of the point of putting these sightings at the end of the book, is to bring it into the 21st century, but give people an opportunity to go out and investigate on their own.
Okay, let's talk about Stokes. That's one you looked into, right?
Yes. And I would have told you before we did the book that I didn't believe the case. I thought he was making the thing up, because that was basically the Air Force conclusion. This was 1957, again, not long after the Levelland sightings. Mm-hmm. And you go back and you look at the Air Force file on the Stokes case. Stokes was an engineer at White Sands, Holloman Air Force Base. And he said that he was going from Alamogordo to El Paso, and the road there goes to a place called Oro Grande. Mm-hmm. And he came to a place where there's a number of cars stalled, and his car began to stall, and he pulled over the road, and there were 6 or 7 cars there, and they were watching this UFO overhead swing by and do some things. And after it disappeared, he realized he had a light sunburn on part of his face and on part of his arm, where he was looking out the window of the car. When he got back to Alamogordo, he called his boss and told him what he'd seen and what had happened. His boss actually alerted the media. The skeptics say, well, the first thing he did was call the media. No, he didn't do that. He called his boss. His boss called the media. Cora Lorenzen from APRO and her husband Jim lived in Alamogordo at the time. So they got in touch with Stokes. He went to the radio station. They saw this reddishness on his arm and his face, that he had the light sunburn. They talked to him. They got an interview with him. The Air Force finally investigated a couple of days later. They said, well, we saw no evidence of the sunburn. Well, yeah, it faded by then, guys. Come on. And they said, well, he said there were 6 cars. Then he said there were 7 cars. Well, he didn't count the cars. Who cares? He provided a drawing, and so you can see how many cars were lined up there. The only problem with the case is he provided the names of 2 people who may have been working at White Sands, but nobody ever found those guys to corroborate his story. But he went to the hospital. He was treated in the hospital. The news media, the radio station guy there interviewed him. He thought it was very credible. He put it on the news wire, and then of course the news media went nuts over this thing. But it's an interesting case, and the Air Force wrote it off. He said, well, Stokes claimed to be an engineer, and he's not. Well, he'd been a 20-year man in the Navy. He was working as an engineer at Holloman Air Force Base. His boss referred to him as an engineer, and not long after this event, got promoted into a position of more responsibility. So everybody saw him as an engineer. So the fact he said he was an engineer, but he didn't have formal training, who cares? That's the kind of smear they would do to these people. Well, he said he was an engineer, but we can find no college credits to suggest that. Yeah, he's working as an engineer. What else do you call him?
Okay. Let's come back to present time, Kevin. Do you know whether or not the U.S. government is actively still doing UFO investigations? I would think they would be, despite their statement that it's not a threat to national security. If something's flying around in our skies,
I would say this, that
especially
the Air Force
these days,
is required to investigate UFO sightings.
Yes.
Simply because that's their mission.
Right.
But Project Blue Book closed in 1969, and they said, we're all done. We don't investigate UFOs anymore. This is something they'd done before. Originally, it was Project Sign in 1947. They said, well, we studied this. We couldn't find anything. We've closed Project Sign. What they did was change the name to Project Grudge and keep on investigating. Mm-hmm. In the early 1950s, they did the same thing. Said, well, we've had this big report. There's nothing to it. We're not investigating. They changed the name to Blue Book and kept right on investigating.
So you think it's still going on today?
Yes.
Okay.
We know it was. We know what it was became. It became Project Moondust. Well, Moondust began in 1957, but Moondust had a UFO component to it, and it was being investigated. It investigated UFO sightings. Moondust investigated UFO sightings. Senator Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico wrote to the U.S. Air Force, United States Senator Jeff Bingaman, and said, "I'd like to know something about Project Moondust." And the Air Force response is, "There's no such mission." When the Air Force was presented with the documentation that was inadvertently released through FOIA by the State Department that says Project Moondust on it, and it says UFO on it, the Air Force said, "We'd like to amend our last statement. Moondust did exist, but we never used it." I found at least 13 instances where Moondust was deployed into foreign nations to study UFO, to pick up UFO-related materials.
Okay, why, Kevin, when there are UFO reports in Australia, does the Australian government defer comment or investigation to the U.S. government? I've been wondering about that forever.
They didn't really defer to it. They asked the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. government, what they thought of UFOs, and they figured that the United States was the experts on this because we've been running these investigations for so long and talking about it.
Yeah.
And so they deferred to the United States. They assumed they were getting the straight dope from the United States, that there's nothing to this. And we can now show that like I said before, that there was something to it, and the Air Force was at best simply the officers who were responding to the Australians were simply misinformed. Mm-hmm. That's the simplest explanation, or they were purposely misguiding the Australians.
Okay.
So you've got that sort of thing going on, but it's clear that this investigation in 1985 when Moondust was compromised, I think it was Robert Todd sent a letter to the FOIA request asking what the new name of the project was, and he was told is properly classified and not releasable. So all they did was change the name from Moondust to something else, and we have not found out what that name was. But as late as 1985, we knew they were still investigating UFOs based on the documentation.
All right. Based on all your years of research, Kevin, do you think that the aliens, or whoever they are here to in some way harm us in the long run, or do you think they are here to help us? There are many who believe they're here to help us.
I don't think it's either. I think they're just here to see what's going on and study the course of our civilization, see where we're going. I see nothing to suggest they're hostile, unless you subscribe to David Jacobs' theory that they're interbreeding with us and creating a race of hybrids for some nefarious purpose.
Well, I hate to say it, Kevin, but I think I do.
But I'm not sure that's. I don't.
Actually, it makes all the sense in the world, Kevin. If you want to, just bear with me for a second. If you want to take over a planet, Kevin, you don't need ray guns. You don't need flashes in the night and cities destroyed. It's a far more elegant way to do it, to take it over slowly, to make genetic changes, and to infiltrate bit by bit by bit. It makes much more sense than, the classic invasion story with big ships and destructive rays and all of that.
Yeah, but the big invasion stories are a lot more fun. But no, I understand exactly what you're saying, and that's my thought is too. You modify the population, or your population for that matter, because you're doing it both, to inhabit this environment that we have created, the environment we have here. But I guess you can look at that as hostile intent.
I do.
It's certainly not benign, but I've always thought of them as being not overtly hostile.
Well, look, Kevin, if that would be true, if they're, let's say, taking human fetuses that are partially developed and taking these from women who have been pregnant and suddenly are not pregnant, a lot of information about all of that, then to me that's hostile. It's I don't know how to put it. It's insidious and it's hostile.
Insidious is a good word for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly insidious, and it's certainly a way of opening up a planet to your populations.
Right.
Um,
Don't feel obligated to agree with me at all.
No, I'm struggling with the concept of hostility, I guess, because it seems to be much more benign than the alien invasion that is so much fun in the movies. And I've never understood that anyway, why they would have to invade us the way they always do in the movies, but that's a whole other argument.
Well, they wouldn't have to. From what I can see, we're a fairly rare planet. We have a lot of resources. We seem to be in the so-called Goldilocks zone. We might be attractive to aliens in one way or the other, and they may be tracking us. They may be developing us.
But I'm thinking if you're looking at the elements we have, you don't need to come this deep into the solar system to find that sort of thing.
We don't know that.
Comets that can provide you all the water you want.
Yes.
You've got the Kuiper belt that has the minerals and all of that involved in it.
Yeah, but you're talking about things. I'm talking about how rare is intelligent life. Yeah.
Yes, I understand that, and I was getting to that point.
Okay, all right.
I'm just saying if you're interested in that sort of thing, then you don't need to come to Earth to get it. If you're interested in the fact that the planet's in the Goldilocks zone and you need a space for your people, then the Earth becomes much more attractive because we're in the Goldilocks zone. So it really depends on what your mission is and what you're looking for to do. And I just don't. I struggle with the hostility of it because it seems to be rather benign the way they're doing it, but it is an attempt to take over without firing a shot.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you were a woman and you had a pregnancy, and then one day suddenly it was gone, and you had some sort of encounter, you might consider it very hostile indeed. And if somebody's toying with our genetic structure, until I know otherwise, to me that seems rather hostile.
Yes. I understand what you're saying.
All right. Let's take a few calls. Hello there on the phone. You're on the air with Kevin Randle. Hi.
I'd like to ask Kevin a question with regards to kick 846, 2852, or Tabby as they have it.
Sure.
And possibly issue a statement of my own feelings and proofs, if you want to hear it.
Well, okay, ask the question first.
Oh, that's not fair.
Yes, it is.
The question is, what are his feelings with the most recent interpretation in what I think is disinformation as far as what is going on?
Okay, there has been no more recent determination I'm aware of, other than the megastructures that were mentioned and the dips in luminosity. So if you have something newer than that, I'm listening.
Yeah, the Dynasphere, which would have to be an incomplete Dynasphere,
You mean a Dyson sphere, right?
Yeah, yes, Dyson sphere. Sorry, they had the last I had heard on seen it on that is they were estimating that they had an oblate spheroid star which was pulsing and looking rather strange, and they had graphed out some graphs indicating what they had estimated this would look like in the laboratory compared to the graphs seen and recorded from spatial observations. And my own personal background is in sciences and chemistry and things like that, looking at graphs and traces of hyperosmolar chromatin and everything.
Okay, but you're not telling me anything new. I was aware of what they've got and the graphs. I've seen them. We had them up on the website. So what's new?
Oh, yeah, I did not believe those graphs really coincided with each other. the question is, does he believe this oblate spheroid possibility, or is it nothing but misconjecture and disinformation?
Okay. In other words, Kevin, do you think there is really something there, or do you think they're just, guessing?
I think there's something there, and I think it's interesting that one of the conclusions being drawn is that it's an artificial construct, and that's an exciting possibility. Can it be something natural that we haven't observed in other parts of the galaxy? Absolutely. But I think the most exciting prospect is that it's something artificial. I think that's an exciting possibility. And, I'm looking forward to them determining exactly what they're seeing there, and if it is suggestive of an alien intelligence.
Yeah,
of course, they wouldn't be aliens in their home world, but
right.
Alien to us.
Right. Well, I couldn't quite figure out where he was headed there. I think the information is still the same. The spacecraft, the telescope has not been repaired, so the information remains what we had. All right, we're going to take a break right here. Kevin Randle is my guest from the high desert. This is Midnight in the Desert, the cold, cold desert.
To initiate a dialogue sequence with Art Bell, please direct your finger digits and call 1-952-225-5278. That's 1-952. Call Art.
Hi, everybody. All right, I'm trying to follow breaking news from Paris as we continue with the Kevin Randle interview. Certainly, the suspects are pinned down. It was known that one of those suspects that did not set off his vest probably is still in possession of that vest. So that could explode, I suppose. We know there's gunfire going on. It's a very, very fluid situation, and I'm going to try to continue to update you as I can. But these are ongoing events, and I want to be very careful not to say something that is simply not true at this hour. Just know that they do have them pinned down, or some of them pinned down. So here we go. Let's go back to Kevin and the phone line, and let's go to Las Vegas for Kevin Randle. Hi.
Hi. I have some information about the Travis Walton situation. That case was investigated when it happened by the local MUFON office that was down in, or chapter, I guess, that was down in either the Phoenix area, it could have been up in Fountain Hills, and also simultaneously by another UFO organization called Ground Saucer Watch, which was also in Phoenix.
And what did they find?
Well, they came up with exactly the same scenario, that the logging company that Walton and his friends worked for had a contract that they could not fulfill, and that they had to come up with a story that would say that their employees were afraid to go into this one area, which, by the way, Travis Walton's family had a cabin right up in that area. Mm-hmm. So this was the story that they came up with. And that the story was just a complete fraud. This is what I was told.
Well, if that's true, why do you think that ultimately they passed several lie detector exams? I'm not talking about just one person, but the whole group.
They actually did not pass the first lie detector exam.
Well, actually, one was, excuse me, ma'am, one of them tested only as questionable. They couldn't say one way or the other. Everybody else passed. That's the truth.
Well, I saw I saw an extensive interview on television by one of the news channels in which they interviewed the man who gave the first lie detector test to him.
Yes.
That he was considered the finest lie detector expert in the state of Arizona,
that's right.
and actually did the work for the FBI in Arizona. And he was there, and I mean, they interviewed him right there, and out of his own mouth came the words that he had been contacted by the National Enquirer and hired by them. And they said that they did not want him to tell anybody, even in his family, where he was going. And he said he would not do that, and that he they told him he was going to this hotel where he would do the polygraph. So they said, well, okay, they relented. You can tell your wife, what hotel you're going to be at. He administered the lie detector tests to all of them.
Yeah.
And he said all of them failed. And at that point, the National Enquirer took him into another room in the hotel.
Oh, please. You're beginning by telling me this man is beyond reproach, the very best, and now you're telling me that he got paid off by the National Enquirer?
No. They tried to get him to sign a document saying that he would not reveal the results of the polygraph exam, and he refused to do it.
But, ma'am, he did reveal the results of the exam, and they passed. There was one guy, I can't recall his name.
Mr. Bell, let me interject. He refused to sign the document that he would not say that they had failed. So he was free to say, yes, they had failed.
Okay, I see. All right, so they passed. I mean, so your point is?
That the Travis Walton whole story is just a fraud.
No,
everybody
Wait a minute.
You've got some of the facts twisted around here. The National Enquirer helped Jim Lorenzen and APRO finance the first polygraph examination, and the guy said that he saw, I think it was actually Walton, he believed that Walton was trying to defeat the polygraph through various techniques, and so he decided that it was an indication of deception.
Well, there was one that was inconclusive. There was one excuse me, Kevin.
Yes.
There was one result that was inconclusive. Everybody else passed, not just once, but twice.
Well, that was subsequent to that. But, I mean, I've even talked to people down there. I lived in Arizona for almost 30 years. And I've talked to someone from GSW who was the head of GSW. And I've seen this guy interviewed. And everybody else who were the first people who were testing him and investigating, they all say that this is a completely made-up story. And you know what?
No, they don't. Ma'am, I'm sorry. No, they don't. The examiner who gave the test came up with one inconclusive from the group. Walton and everybody else, other than the inconclusive, and that's not a negative, passed. I mean, that's a fact.
That's not what he said on television. I did 4 years of public corruption investigation. I come from a big-time newspaper family, and you always take the first story that's told, because after that, everybody has time to cover their ass and come up with a different story.
All right.
And I will go with the guy who was head of GSW who investigated, and I'll go with the polygraph.
But the GSW guys weren't the first ones to investigate it. It was Jim Lorenzen and APRO that got the case first.
Right.
And Philip Klass is the one that came up with some of this information that you're telling us now. And Philip Klass was attempting to destroy the case.
For those who don't know, Mr. Klass is a debunker extraordinaire.
Yeah, I am aware of that. But as I say, I talked to the head of GSW, and I had talked to somebody from MUFON, and I heard and I watched the extensive interview on television, and I'm going with that.
Okay, well, go with that. Thank you. If you don't want to go with the facts, then nobody can make you do so. I appreciate your input, ma'am, but you're wrong. It's simple as that. You want to add to that, Kevin?
Well, I was going to say the nonsense about the contract is something that Phil Klass spewed in an attempt to provide a motivation for them creating this tale. But it turns out that even though they had not finished their contract on time, they got an extension, and there was really no pressure on them.
I was aware of that.
Financial pressure on them to do anything. That was Philip Klass's idea.
Yeah, well, Philip. Let's go to Troy on Skype. Hello, Troy.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing okay, but you're way far away from the microphone. I can't put you on the air like that. If you can get close to your mic, whatever you're using for a mic, if it's in your laptop.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Oh, much better, yeah.
Awesome. All right, so glad to be talking to you. Big fan since I was a kid. Kevin, same with you. I remember reading your book, UFO Cases, when I was like 10 or 13 years old. Anyway, I have a question.
Oh, I don't want to hear that. It makes me feel so old.
Well,
sorry.
Try sitting where I am every night. Anyway, go ahead.
So the thing is I was coming back from a science competition in Yuma, Arizona, and on that night, it was the night of the Phoenix Lights. And when we were driving back on, I think it was the 8th, there was this weird light. It was like really late at night, and it was like circling around up in the sky, zigzagged around, and then just shot off. And we were all like, "Oh my God, what was that? What's that?" And then we got home, and there was all these news reports about the Phoenix Lights, and I was just curious if you had heard anything else about that happening that night.
And you'll have to come back tomorrow to hear that answer, as we have approached the end of our time for this day in Dominion. As always, like, share, and subscribe. Get us to the goal of 50,000 views, 1,000 subscribers. Boxy sends those nice red boxes. Google pays attention. Sponsors below, and hope to have a couple new ones here very quickly. Till then, like, share, and subscribe. Be kind to one another. As again, when it boils down, that's all we have. And it's always a great new world to release the Krakens in each and every one of us. Till then, have a great evening. Enjoy your night's rest. We'll see you tomorrow as we march along to get that cake and take care of the archdemon as the leper kitties will leave and the celebration of the anniversary will commence as we return here from day one. Have a